Okay. Okay, Be'ez Hashem, today's daf is daf Samech Zayin, and we're going to begin on daf Samech Vav and Beis. We just left off with 2 points before we get to the Mishnah, which is going to be a new topic. We learned in the previous Gemara, Uben Grusha Ben Chalutza Da Avoidasa Keshera Manola. The question is, let's say a Kohen did the Avoida, and then he finds out that his mother was a divorcee, and really he's a Cholol, and he's been serving in the Beis Hamikdash for 10 years. What happens to all the service that he did retroactively? So we know it's kosher. It means that if he served, no one has to repeat and do the carbon if they used him as the kohen. So how do you know that? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Shmuel, the pasuk says, it says by Pinchas, who became a kohen, that this kahuna will be to him and his children after. Bein zera kosher, bein zera apostle. No matter what, even if his children are kosher or not kosher, their avodah is okay. The kahuna still affects. Hi, Lewis. We just began. We're on Samech Vav Amid Beis, just before the Mishnah. We're just going to get to the Mishnah, and then it will be a new topic. Avu de Shmuel Amar, of the father of Shmuel, says Mahacha Baruch Hashem Chelu Foil Yod of Tirza. Afilu chulin shabai tirza, even a kohen cholol that does the service, b'di'evet, it's good. He shouldn't do the service. You got to retire him if you find out that he's a ben gerusha. But if he did it already, the service is kosher. Rabbi Yanai Amar Mahacha v'osal kohen ashiyah b'yamim hein. You should come visit the kohen that's living in your time. So that's what the pasuk says. Will you ever think will you go to a kohen that's not in your day? Of course you go to the kohen that's living in your time. It means that even if you come across a kohen that you thought for many years that he's kosher, then you find out that he was a ben grusha, he was a cholol, we still call him a kohen. And any service that he conducted in the Beis Hamikdash is still valid. But what happens? The opposite. This is important. Balmum, the avoidasoi psula manola. Let's say you have a balmum, a handicapped kohen that did the service, and then they discover he has a handicap. Let's say he's missing a finger. So how do you know? B'di'evet, every service that he did is invalid. That has to be repeated. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Amar Kral Chein Emor Hini Nois Nois Brisi Shalom. The Torah gave Pinchas the kohuna, and it calls it that he should be shalom, kishu shalem, only when he is complete. In other words, when he doesn't have any handicap, he's not a balmum. But like kishuhu chaser, not if he's missing any limb, then it's no good. Says the Gemara of Shalem Ksiv. The pasuk says shalom. It doesn't say it's shalem. Amar Rabbi Nachman vav de shalom katihi. The vav. If you look at the Chumash, the Vav in Shalom is cut off. It's not a complete Vav. So you could read it as Shalem, that a Kohen, only if he is complete and not handicapped, is avodas kosher. But if you find out that he was a Balmum, retroactively, everything he did is no good. Hi, Alan. We just began. We're at the Mishnah of Samech Vav Amid Beis. New topic. Yes, new topic. Kol makam sheyesh. This is very simple. You're probably familiar with this. Kol makam sheyesh kedushin ve'ein avera. Whenever there is, now notice it says any place where there's kedushin and there's no avera done. In other words, it's a permitted marriage. Havlad hoylech hachazacha. You go. The child will take after the father. Ve'ezazat. What's an example? Notice ve'ezazat. These are the examples. Kohenes Leviah of Yisraelis. No matter what the girl is, if she's a Bas Kohen, a Leviah of Yisraelis. Shnisu l'kohen Levi Yisrael, they got married to a Kohen Levi Yisrael, you always go after your father. If your father was a Kohen, you're a Kohen. If your father was a Levi, you're a Levi. And so if your father was Yisrael, you're Yisrael, doesn't matter what your mother is. So that's the first part of the Mishnah. Second thing the Mishnah tells you, anytime the Kedushin is good, but there's a sin during this marriage. Sometimes the Kedushin can take effect despite the fact that there is a sin. So Havlad hoylech acha par hagam. The child takes after the sin part of the marriage. What's an example? Zu almana l'kohen gadol. Almana marrying a kohen gadol. Grusha v'chalutza l'kohen headed. A gerusha, a divorcee, marrying a regular kohen is a marriage that could take effect, but the child will not be a kohen. The child will go after the mother, and his kedushas kahuna will be emptied. That's called a cholol. Or mamzeres unisina Yisrael. A mamzeres, as you know, who is not supposed to go into Kahal Hashem, or Nesina, where a group, which is a certain nation called the Nesinim, that David HaMelech was geyser, that we should not marry into them. Yeshua was geyser. But so therefore, Bas Yisrael, a mamzer nasin, or the opposite. If the girl is a Bas Yisrael, is marrying a mamzer nasin, so then the child will be a mamzer. So if the father's the dad is a mamzer and the mother is a regular Yisrael, the child will go after the pogam. And the opposite is also true. If the man is a Yisrael and the woman is a mamzeres, the child will be a mamzeres. So you go after who is the illegal one, who is the pogam. If it's somebody you can't make kedushin, because you would get chorus, like say your sister. You can't marry your sister, but other people can marry your sister. So if you marry your sister, the vlad is a mamzer. Or you marry your aunt, the vlad's a mamzer. And that's what he says. Whoever comes on all arayos b'Torah, that child is a mamzer. Now, what happens if you marry a shiksa? What happens if you're a mezana with a shiksa? What is the child? Nobody, if there's a girl that nobody can marry, not you, not anybody else, so the child will be exactly like what she is. What's an example? If a Yisrael is mezana with a shivcha or a goita, so then the child goes after the mother, and the child is a goy. Zog the Gemara. Kol makom sheyesh kedushin, wherever there's kedushin. You told me whenever there's a kosher marriage, you go after the father. Klali, is it a general rule, says Rish Lakish, that the vlad will go after the zachar? Is that a general rule? Hare, I'll give you a case. We go to Samazai Namral. This is case number one. A ger that marries a mamzeres. A ger can marry a mamzer. You know that? Because the mamzer is not allowed to marry the Jewish nation, but a convert can marry a mamzeres. The Yesh Kedushin Ve'in Avera. And Havlad is not, the child is not a ger, the child is not a Yisrael, like the father is. Havlad Hoylech HaChaparkam, you go after the mother. And the child is a mamzer. The Tanya we learned to the Brisa, ger shnos mamzeres, a ger that married a mamzer, which is good, which is a good marriage. Havlad mamzer, the child is a mamzer. Divrei Rabbi Yosi. So says Rabbi Yosi. So this is what Rabbi Yosi said. So Amalei, mi savrit masnisin Rabbi Yosi. So that's the question Rabbi Yochanan asked. So the Gemara answered, Amalei, mi savrit, do you think masnisin Rabbi Yosi? Our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Yosi. Masnisin Rabbi Yehuda. Our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Yehuda. The Gamar who said ger lo yisa mamzeres. It's an avera for a ger to marry mamzeres, so it doesn't include it. The yesh kedushin yesh avera avlad hoylech achar pagam. So there is an example of a bad marriage. Ger marrying a mamzeres is an avera, but the kedushin takes effect, and the child will go like the mamzeres, will go after the mother. So now the Gemara just established that our Mishnah goes according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So if that's the case, then it's nayu. The question is, why don't we use that as an example of the second part of the Mishnah, which says that if there's a bad marriage, the vlad hoylech achar pogam. We didn't give this example of ger marrying a mamzeres. And says the Gemara, Tana kol mokum the sefer latuyed. It uses a general rule, kol mokum, in the second part of the Mishnah. It says kol mokum that there's an avera and there's a kedushin. The vlad goes after the pogam, so that kol mokum includes this case that's not written in the Mishnah of ger marrying a mamzeres. That's the first teretz. If you want, I can say our Mishnah holds a ger could marry a mamzer. La'olam Rabbi Yosi. If it goes like Rabbi Yosi, then why? Then this is an example that you're not going after the father. It's a kosher marriage, and you're going after the mother. The answer is V'tona ezezula mute. The Torah, the Mishnah writes, these are the cases. There are some cases that are an exclusion to the rule. So that's it. So that includes as an exclusion to the rule. And ger marrying a mamzeres Even though it's a kosher marriage, you'll go after the mother. That's why the Mishnah says ezizu. So normally you go after the father by kosher marriages, but this one you'll go after the mother. That's the second teretz. Says Gemara, "Ve'ezizu usulai." Are these the only cases that you go after the father? Let's say you always go after the father by kosher marriage, and not the mother. Those are the only cases in the Mishnah. V'harei, I'll give you another example. Cholol shenasu bas Yisrael, a kohen who's a cholol. We know that's a son of a ben grusha that married a bas Yisrael. The Yesh Kiddushin ve'ein avera. There's Kiddushin and there's no avera. A cholol can marry a bas Yisrael. Chavlad hoylech achar zacha. The kohen, the son, is not a kohen. He's an empty kohen. So we see that it's a kosher marriage, and you go after the father. So why didn't our Mishnah include that as one of the examples? Answers the Gemara, Haloi kasha k'd Rabbi Yistoi bar Rabbi Yehuda. Our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Yistoi bar Rabbi Yehuda, who holds a cholol marrying a bas Yisrael. The child is a kosher kohen. So his father is a cholol, but the child will be a kosher kohen, because Rabbi Yistoi bar Yehuda says a statement that every Jewish girl is like a mikvah for the cholol. So if a cholol marries a bas Yisrael, the child is not a cholol, a bad kohen, but it's actually a regular kohen. He's more stronger than his father. Says the Gemara, okay, let's give another case where you go after the father. And it's not written in the Mishnah. It's a kosher marriage. It's not written in the Mishnah. The opposite case. You have a Yisrael that married a chalola. The yesh kedushin ve'ein avera. There's kedushin and there is no avera. Yisrael marrying a chalola, there's no avera there. Havlad hoylech achar zacha. The child is Yisrael, right? So how come our Mishnah didn't mention that as one of the examples? Answers the Gemara, Tana kol mokum d'reish latuya. That's why it says kol mokum. That kol mokum is like a general rule in the Mishnah, which says that the following list is not the exhaustive list, the only list. There's things that we're not even mentioning in the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, v'nisnai ba'adeh. Why did it leave it out? Why did it hint to it in the word kol mokum? Use it as part of the list. Yisrael marrying a chalola. Answers the Gemara, because it's impossible to put it into the list and make the Mishnah make sense. Hey, how should we list it? Kohenes, Leviav, Yisraelis, B'chalola. A Kohenes, the female Kohenes, Leviav, Yisraelis, and a female Chalola. Shenisis, Lekoyen, Levi, Yisrael, right? Then you go after the father. Wait a second. A Kohen cannot marry a female Chalola. The chalola kohen michazi, a chalola is not isha zainov a chalola yikachu. So a chalola is not allowed to marry a kohen. Oh, so because of that, therefore, it doesn't include it in our Mishnah. So that's why it's hinted in the Kol Mokum. Says the Gemara, V'ika the Rabba Babachona. Well, there's things missing. Rabba Babachona. The Amar Rabba Babachona. Rabba Babachona said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, here, this is what you should know. A Mitzri, a ger that became a Mitzri ger, Egyptian ger, cannot marry a Jewish person, cannot marry a Jewish girl, right? Only the grandson of that Egyptian is the third generation, could marry into the Jewish family. So now, Mitzri Sheni, you have a second generation Mitzri. That means his father and mother were both Mitzrim, and he is the second generation. He married Shnasa Mitzris Rishona. He married a first generation Mitzris, that he married a girl that just became a Gioris, a Mitzri girl. So he's a Sheni, and she is a Rishon. They have a child, B'nah Shlishi Hava. It's a permitted marriage. Mitzri marrying a Mitzris is a permitted marriage, and the child is a Shlishi. So who you call going the child? The child goes after the father. So here's a kosher marriage and an example where you go after the father. Again, why isn't it listed in our Mishnah? Answers the Gemara, Tanu Kol Mokum the Reish Latuyah. The Kol Mokum of Reish, it's included in that general rule of Kol Mokum. According to Ravdimi, the Amar Sheni Hava, but according to Ravdimi, that says no, you go after the mother. So then this is not part of the general rule that you go after the father. Tana Ezazu Lamiute. So the Ezazu in the Reish of the Mishnah, that this is the list. Saying that it's not it excludes that not every case you're going to go after the father when there's a kosher marriage. Sometimes you're going to go after the mother, because Ravdimi's opinion is that Mitzri Sheni, the married Mitzri Sheni, you go after the mother and the child is a Sheni. Says the Gemara, Va'ika, there's another case. Va'ika, there's another thing Dichi also Rabin Amar Rabbi Yochanan, when Rabin Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, "Beumas halach acha zacha, niskayru halach acha hapogam shebek shneyem." So this is talking about sometimes you go after the father before they're married. They go before the goyim. Let's say you go after the father. You always go after the father before they become a gerim. For example, you have a Knani that marries a Japanese woman. Now, Knani, you know, from the 7 nations, you have to kill them out. So what is the child? The child is a Knani. That's until they get married. When they become Gerim, so then you go after the worst. The worst. We'll discuss that in a minute. But you see, it's not a general rule. When they become a ger and it's a kosher marriage, sometimes you go after the father, but sometimes you'll go after the mother. So Tana Ezezu Lemuute. So that's why it's not included in the Mishnah. It doesn't fit into the general rule of the Mishnah that you always go after the father by a kosher marriage. And says the Gemara, Tana Ezezu Lemuute. The Ezezu is an exclusive and saying that yes, there are things that are exceptions to the rule. So now the Gemara just says, and we'll finish this part of the Gemara, Hai Mai. Let's try to understand this. You said that there are 4 different cases, and some are exceptions to the rule, and some fit into the rule, but are not listed in the Mishnah. So, if you said like the teretz, the original teretz of the Gemara, of why doesn't the Mishnah say ger shenosa mamzeres, and that you go after the mother? So the first teretz is, our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Yehuda, that it's not a legal marriage. So then, if you say that, our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Yehuda, ger that marrying a mamzeres is not a legal marriage. Kol mokum the reisha, the extra kol mokum of the reisha, la tuye yisrael shenosa chalala, that Yisrael that married a Chalola, the way you go after the father. Ud Rabba Babachon, and Rabba Babachon's case, if you go back to what Rabba Babachon's case is, Mitzri Sheni marrying a Mitzri Yeshayna, the kid is a Shlishi. 2 cases that are, you go after the father, which are not written in the Mishnah. And what is Ezezu? The Ezezu of the Reisha is saying that this is the exhaustive list, but there are exceptions. Lemute Ravdimi Ravim. If you hold like Ravdimi, that you go after the mother by Mitzri Sheni that marries a Mitzri Sheni, or Ravin, or Ravin, which says sometimes when 2 Gerim become Gerim, you go after the mother. So fine, everything stims. We go to Amid Beis. Kol Makam the Seifa. Kol Makam of the Sefer Latuya Gersh Nas Mamzeres. If you say our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Kol Makam of this 8th end of the Mishnah, of the second part of the Mishnah, is including an illegal marriage of Ger marrying a Mamzeres, because Rabbi Yehuda holds a Ger cannot marry a Mamzeres, right? There's a Kiddushin, there's an Avera. So notice that we don't say Ezezu of the Sefer. If you say our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Yehuda, what is the Ezezu of the Sefer coming to tell you? But the Gemara just ignores that for a minute. El Yamrit Rabbi Yosi, if you hold our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Yosi, where Ger could marry an Mamzeres, Kol Mokum the Reisha Keda Amram. Kol Mokum of the Reisha includes Ger marrying a Mamzeres. Ezezu is Keda Amram. Ezezu is Mamayat, all the other things that we mentioned, like Rav Dimi, if you hold like Rav Dimi or Ravim. El Kol Makom the Sefer, like Tuyimai. What are you going to have Kol Makom the Sefer? El Tamech. So the Gemara says, if you say, so that you say our Mishnah cannot go according to Rabbi Yosi. Or Tamech. If you, according to your reasoning, Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you have a problem too. Ezezu the Sefer Lamali. Why do you have to say Ezezu in the end of the Mishnah, in the second part of the Mishnah? You only answered Kol Makom of the Sefer, but you didn't answer what Ezezu is coming to exclude. I did the Tana Reisha Ezezu, Tana Sefer Ezezu. Even according to Rabbi Yehuda, you have to say that sometimes the Mishnah had extra words in the Mishnah because it wants to align itself up with the beginning of the Mishnah. The beginning of the Mishnah needed to use the word Ezezu, so the end of the Mishnah also uses Ezezu. So also over here, I did the Tana Reisha Kol Makom, Tana Nami Sefer Kol Makom. So even according to Rabbi Yosi, since the Reisha had to put in Kol Makom, so the Sefer also puts in the word Kol Makom. Okay, but the Gemara just finished off just explaining the first part of the Mishnah, and sometimes there are exceptions in the rule, and sometimes there are things not mentioned in the Mishnah, but would fit in nicely in the rule of the Mishnah. Let's do another 2 pieces of Gemara. Kufa we learned before. Ki asa Ravin Amar Rabbi Yochanan. When Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael, he learned by Rabbi Yochanan, and he said over a teaching from Rabbi Yochanan. B'umais halach achar zacha. But when it comes to goyim, you always go after the male after the male. This gairu, when they become a ger, Halach achar hapogam shebishneim. Then you go after the one that is worse. Let's see. My beumas halach achar azacha. What does it mean by the goyim? You go after the male. Kedetanya, like we learned in the Brisa. Remember, we are supposed to kill any nation that's from the 7 nations, right? So Benayin, how do I know? Le'echad min ha'umayis shebo al ha'knanis. One of the umayis that came, a Japanese guy, had married a Knaini woman, v'hoilid ben, and they had a son. Sha'ato rashoy l'knoisi be'evi. You don't have to kill him because he's not part of the 7 nations. You go after his father, and his father's Japanese. You're permitted to buy that person as an Eved. Talmud Loimer, because the pasuk says, "V'gam b'nei hatoshavim agarim imochem mehem teknu." From people who came to live in Eretz Yisrael from other nations, and they intermingled with the Knainim and any of the 7 nations. From them, the Torah says you can buy them. You can buy an Eved from them because you go after the father. Yochel, I would think, of Eved shabal shivcha min ha'umayis v'hoiled ben sha'ata rashoy l'knoisi be'Eved. Look at this. What happens if one of the Knainim, the male Kanani, went to Japan and married a Japanese woman in Japan? Now they have a son. That son moves to Israel. Are you allowed to have him as an Eved, or do you have to kill him? So the answer is you go after the father. Talmud Loiba only things that were born in your land, but not people, a grandson that comes to live in your land. In other words, a Knaini that went to Japan and married a Japanese woman, that son who comes back to Israel, has a din like the Shuvas Amen, because you go after his father. His father was a Knaini, so he's a Knaini, and therefore lo yischaya kol neshama. That's all along that when they're goyim, you go after the male. Nizgairu, but once they become a ger, koilech acha hapogam shebishneim. B'mai, what is that talking about? My pogam ika amoini v'lo yamoinis. Ella, we're talking about Amoini Shenosa Mitzris. If you have an Amoini, remember, the male Amoins are not permitted to come into Klal Yisrael. The females are. That married a Mitzris. By the Mitzris, they could only come into Klal Yisrael, both male and female, after 3 generations. So what happens? An Amoini marries a Mitzris. So sometimes you'll go after the father, and sometimes you'll go after the mother. A ger, they became gerim. If it's a male, so then Shadia Basrei Didei, then you go after the Amoinim, and the kid is a din of Amoin and can never marry a Jewish girl. The Imnikeva have it, but if it's a female, so then if you went after the father, then it would be permitted to marry a Jewish male. But there we go, take the worst. We Shadia Basrei Didei, and then we say we go after the mother and say, no, this girl has to be 3 generations later, only then can her offspring or granddaughter marry a Jewish guy. Next part of the Mishnah. Kol she'ein olav Kiddushin. This is the last piece of Gemara. The question is, how do you know that no Kiddushin works by chayvei koris? How do I know that if I marry my aunt, the Kiddushin doesn't take, it's not effective? Or any chayvei koris? The Amar Rab Chia Barabba, Amar Rab Yochanan, Motim Ab B'Shem Rab Yani, Rab Achab B'Rei Rava, Motim Ab B'Shem Rab Yosef Glili. Sometimes it was said in the name of Rab Yosef Glili. Amakra, the Torah says when a person divorces his wife, she leaves the house, she should marry somebody else. La'acherim, she could marry anybody, and Kedushin will take effect. And not for relatives. So what the Chumash is saying, that if a relative, you can't marry any of the arayas, and if you do, the Kedushin doesn't take effect. And once you know the Kedushin doesn't take effect, if you do have an offspring, that child is a mamzer. Whenever Kedushin doesn't take effect, and you have an offspring, the child is a mamzer. That we know from other places. But here we see that Kedushin is not taking effect, because the Torah says you can marry not your relatives. Once you get divorced, marry somebody from another family. Maybe the Torah is telling you can marry anybody, but don't marry the son of your husband. Let's say your stepson. Maybe the Torah is telling the lady not to marry just the stepson, but any of the arayas she could have Kiddushin working. So the Gemara says, Ben, the Torah already tells you that you're not allowed to marry your stepson. The Torah says a stepson should not take the wife of his father. So why does the Torah say acher? That she should marry somebody else. It teaches you she shouldn't marry any relatives. Maybe the Torah is telling you that both are talking about the son, and the Torah is telling you lechatchila she's not allowed to marry her stepson, and even b'di'evet if she marries the stepson, it doesn't work. But how do you know all the other arayas? The Kiddushin will not work. And so the Gemara lechatchila machais isha nafka, to not marry your stepson, that I know for sure from machais isha. Machais isha, you're not allowed to marry your wife's sister. Right, bikaris loyti kaddish chayav misas bezdin. If there's an isra that you're going to get a misa bezdin if you marry such a person, like kolshkein, certainly you're not allowed to go to make a kedusha. So the Gemara says the final question is idi achais isha. Maybe I have two psukim that tell me that I'm not allowed to marry my wife's sister. One tells me lechatchila you're not allowed to marry your wife's sister, and one tells me hadi'eved. That haisala isha acha tells you that even b'di'eved achos isha you're not allowed to marry. You're not allowed to marry your wife's sister. But what about all the other arayas? Right? Let's say your brother's wife or any other arayas in the Torah. How do you know kedushin will not take effect if you go into a marriage ceremony? So the Gemara says. Everybody, and this is the point. All other arayas you learn with a mamatzinu from achos isha. Ma achos isha miuchedesh. Your wife's sister is special. She erva. You're not allowed to marry her. If you have relations with her on purpose, you get kares. By mistake, you have to bring a kar b'chatas. The loy tafseba kedushin. Kedushin doesn't take effect. Af kol she erva v'chayoven al zadoina kares v'ashigagasi chades li tafsi bei kedushin. Wherever there's an arayas and there's bemezid you get kares and b'shoigig you get kates, kedushin will not take effect. So one more question. So Gemara asks, Bishla makule asi. I can learn all the arayas from a chos isha. Ela eishes is ve'eishes ach ikalam ifrich. How do I know that kedushin with an eishes ish? With a married woman or with your brother's wife, how do you know kedushin doesn't take effect? Because malach isha, they're very different than your wife's sister. You're never allowed to marry your wife's sister. There's no mitzvah to marry. There's no such a thing of a mitzvah to marry your wife's sister. But the wife of your brother, sometimes you're permitted to marry your wife's brother when she falls to yibam. So how do you know where there is no mitzvah of yibam, kedusha would not work? It's different than a chos isha. And of course, same idea by eishes ish. Nami ikal mikrach. Mala halash ke ein laheta b'chay oisrim. Toime be'eishes ish yesh laheta b'chay oisrim. Eishes ish sometimes becomes mutter, because if the husband gives her a divorce, she's permitted to marry anybody she wants. So maybe while she's married to her husband, if someone gives her kedushin takes effect. How do you know all that? This is very important, and we'll end over here. Amakra, the pasuk says, whoever does any of their arayas gets kares. Hukshu kol arayas kulam lachais isha. All the arayas in the Torah are like marrying your wife's sister. Ma chais isha loy tafse be kedushin. We know for a fact that a chais isha kedushin doesn't work. From the hoiselish achsher, and the Torah says lo yikach ishes chais ishtoi. The Torah says that. So af kol arayas kulam, any arayas, whether it's an eshes ish, whether it's an eshes ach, if you whether it's your own sister. Loy tafse by kedushin doesn't work, and hence, because the kedushin doesn't work, if you have a child from that, the child will be a mamzer. Okay, we'll stop over here.
Thank.
So the Gemara continues and says, "Ihachi." If that's the source, we go to the Samaches Samar Aleph. Ihachi afila needed nami. Even if you have relations with a nida, with your wife as a nida, the child should be a mamza. Why did Abai say that everybody, we all agree that if you have relations with your wife who's a nida, or your wife that is a soita that didn't drink, which is only a lav, that vlad is not a mamza. I thought every chayvit kares should be the child should be a mamza. The pasuk says ushin idasoi olav afilu b'shas nidasoi tehei bayabaya. Even when she is a nida, the kedushin is still in effect, and therefore, despite being a kares to have relations with your wife as a nida, the child will not be a mamzer. Michte. The question is, okay, you can compare all the arayas, ikalakshuya lenida, you can compare them to nida, the ikalakshuya leachaisisha, you can compare them to achaisisha, where kedushin will not take effect, or you can compare them to nida, where kedushin is still in effect. My chaz is, why do you compare all arayas to makshas luhu lachaisisha aksha lanida? Why do you compare all arayas to achaisisha to say any arayas kedushin will not take effect? Compare them to nida, where kedushin will take effect. And says the Gemara, we have a general rule. If you have a choice to compare things, kula, one is lenient, v'chumra, one is strict, v'chumra makshina, we go strict. And therefore, arayas, we have a choice to compare them to nida or compare them to achais isha. We'll compare them to achais isha because it's stricter. And by comparing them to achais isha, we know giving kedushin to any other arayas will not take effect.